In this part of the presentation, I'm going to look at autism in particular and how we can support learners in languages with autism. And the reason I've chosen autism is because it is a neurodevelopmental difference, which means that children with autism may communicate and interact with people in different ways and may have difficulties with it. And seeing as languages is all about communication, it seems really apt to be able to sort of maybe highlight this and talk about it. So it's a condition, and there is a wide variety of differences between children who have autism. There's no one size fits all. So it's very important to make sure you know your individual learners and what they might have difficulties with, what they're particularly good at, where they are challenged or where they might need extra support, and also where their strengths are. So as the information here shows, it's also to do with how information is processed. And so they may take information in different ways. So there's a resource here looking at autism in particular and learning foreign languages. And so I've taken some of the ideas from this resource. So children with autism have difficulties, particularly with these areas, these 4 areas really: social interactions, social communication, flexibility, which also is to do with transitions, and sensory issues. So there'll be differences within each of those, and not all children will have difficulties with those different areas, but it's worth bearing that in mind. So what I've done is I've tried to look at those areas and think about, for the languages classroom, how it might affect them. So, for instance, children might find it hard to work with other children. They might find it difficult to take turns. They might feel quite anxious about performing in front of the class, and that's something that a lot of children struggle with, but some children will find that more difficult. So we need to think potentially how we are going to facilitate that. So it might be, for instance, with turn taking, you might have to set something up to enable children within a group to all take turns. And I've done this before using, felt tip pens or Lego, where each child has a certain number of items, and they have to either say something or have a go at it for the corresponding number of items that they have. So that's just a structured approach to how everybody in the group can be included and can be supported and encouraged to have a go. It might be that working with others is really difficult, so you might need to think carefully about who they're working with. And it might be that sometimes children find it easy to work on their own, and you need to consider that balance between whether they work with others or whether they work on their own, and what support is needed to put in place for that. In terms of performance in front of the class, can you look at alternatives? Can they, for instance, perform privately outside of the classroom, just to yourself as the teacher, or can they record themselves if they're happy with that, using a video? Does it need to be in front of the class? What's the point of the performance? Other areas to look at, things like social communication. So children might struggle with eye contact, and often we use eye contact when we're communicating to show understanding, to show that we're listening. But do we need to insist on it? There could be other ways of children engaging and showing their understanding, using non-verbal cues, for instance. They might have difficulty with social conventions, knowing how, for instance, a conversation starts and finishes, that sort of politeness of saying hello and goodbye, and we need to do that in the foreign language. So those might need to be taught, or they might need to be stated, in this conversation, you need to include the following, and just really breaking it down and not making any presumptions. In the languages classroom, we also generally have lots of different types of activities. and children might be physically moving around from one activity to another, or they might be just moving from one activity to another, sitting at their desk. And so children who struggle with flexibility and different classroom routines might find that quite hard. They might find the way the classroom is set up difficult if you've moved all the classroom tables and chairs, for instance, for a speaking performance. So it's not about not doing it, but it's about being aware of it and perhaps supporting learners by warning them what's going to happen and making sure that they know that and, in advance of that lesson. Does the whole classroom need to be changed around? Do you need to do lots of different activities? Can you prioritize certain activities? And can children just do certain key ones rather than doing lots of different ones if that's too much change? For children who do struggle with flexibility, it could be things like listening to different resources. It might be quite hard because it's a different voice, not something they're used to. That might cause them anxiety. So really just thinking about, the resources that we're using, and again, warning the children, maybe if you're using a different listening resource, you speaking it first of all before playing it by another speaker, if it's a little video, for instance. And children who struggle with flexibility might find different grammar rules hard to accept, where there are exceptions to the rules, and might question that and might, get annoyed with that or frustrated. But they might also be really good at following the rules, So, again, just that level of awareness. And lastly, I think I've put here sensory issues. So some children can get really overwhelmed by noise, by smells, by too much visual stimulation. So thinking about your classroom, the way it's set up, what's on the walls, if you're having music, how loud is it? If you're getting children to be doing a lot of speaking activities and everyone's talking at the same time, how loud is the classroom? Do you need to follow that with a calming activity? Does the child who's finding that difficult, do they need to work in the classroom? Could they work outside the classroom? So, just thinking about that. We also might have lots of props like puppets and things and dice. And the children might really enjoy that. They might enjoy using their hands and that sensory input that they might get from that. And that might be a really good thing. So again, I'm not saying don't do any of these. I'm just saying be aware of them. Make sure you know your learners. Think about what they might find difficult and what you need to put in place to help them. So in this one, I've got some specific examples. And a lot of these I think I've already mentioned before, but ideas for supporting them. So making sure that we're always using visual support. So videos can be really helpful for listening. Otherwise, it's sort of very disparate and separated from the person who's speaking. Trying to reduce the multitasking. So if they are doing a listening activity, do they need to do note taking at the same time? Or can they just do the listening and do the note taking afterwards? Making the unfamiliar familiar, trying to set up daily routines. That might be asking them how they are every day. Can you have the same warm-up activity? Can you use a lot of structure to help bring a level of familiarity to the learners? I've already mentioned social conventions. Learners may well need quite a lot of support, especially for wanting them to use their own language. So can we provide that with a word mat or a gap fill activity where they just have to insert words from a word bank? So they might find that manipulation of language tricky. Already talked about working with peers and who they are working with. And they may well need help with skills. So we can't presume that they'll know how to read or how to listen or how to pick out keywords. That goes with all sorts of children who found that difficult. So really teaching them those basic skills and using activities like highlighting and modeling it to them, going through that example first of all. So hopefully that's some ideas to help you think about what you could do to help these learners.